Nobody at the Gently storage auction wanted Lot 12. It held nothing but a warped upright piano nobody could even get a good look at, wedged behind a collapsed bookshelf in years of undisturbed dust. Maya Fontenot bought it for $60 because she needed a piano for her students and couldn't afford a new one. What she found hidden inside the soundboard would prove an entire New Orleans neighborhood had been robbed twice, once by the storm, and once by the people who promised to help it recover. Maya Fontenot was 36 years old, and she'd been teaching piano out of her cramped Gently apartment for 6 years, ever since the second music school she'd worked for closed its doors for good. She had 11 students, most of them kids from families barely making rent, and she taught most of them for whatever they could afford. Sometimes nothing at all, because she remembered too well what it had been like growing up in the same neighborhood without money for lessons herself. Her own upright piano, a hand-me-down from her grandmother that had survived Katrina in a cousin's garage in Baton Rouge, had finally given out the month before, a cracked soundboard that buzzed on every note below middle C, beyond any repair a piano tuner would take on for what she could pay. The absence of that piano had left a hole in her weekly routine that surprised her with how sharply she felt it. She'd been improvising lessons on a keyboard borrowed from a neighbor for weeks, the plastic keys feeling wrong under her students' fingers, several of the parents already gently asking whether she was still the right teacher for their kids as she couldn't even keep a working instrument. Maya understood the question wasn't unkind, just practical, the same kind of practical calculation every family in Gently had learned to make about anything that cost money it didn't have to spare. She needed a piano the way some people needed a car to keep a job, and she'd started attending every estate sale and auction listing she could find within walking distance, hoping for exactly the kind of unglamorous, overlooked lot that nobody else would want. She'd heard about the storage auction from a flyer taped to the door of the corner store, the kind of notice put up when a facility needed to clear out units abandoned by tenants who'd stopped paying rent years ago and never come back for their things. Storage auctions in New Orleans had a particular flavor of sadness to them if you knew the city. Half the abandoned units, everyone understood without saying it out loud, had belonged to people who left after the storm and never returned, whose lives had simply stopped continuing wherever those boxes and furniture sat gathering dust and mildew. The auction was a small, informal affair, maybe 15 people standing in the gravel lot outside a self-storage facility on Elysian Fields, most of them the same regular resellers who worked every auction in the parish, men with box trucks and callous hands who knew exactly what a unit's contents were worth before the door even rolled up. The facility manager, a heavy-set man named Pete with a clipboard and a bald monotone, moved the crowd from unit to unit with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 100 times before. Maya stood near the back of the group in her one decent jacket, the $80 folded carefully in her front pocket, feeling distinctly out of place among people who bid in hundreds without a flicker of hesitation. Unit 8 held restaurant equipment, and went for $400 to a man who ran a food truck. Unit 9, full of power tools, sparked a small bidding war that ended at $250. By the time they reached Lot 12, Maya's budget, $80 total, all she'd managed to set aside after covering her own rent and her mother's blood pressure medication, was already feeling laughably small next to what the regulars were spending without blinking. Pete rolled up the door on Lot 12, and even he made a face at what was inside. A collapsed particle board bookshelf lay across the front of the unit, its shelves scattered with what looked like decades-old paperback romance novels swollen with moisture damage. Water stains climbed the walls in dark tide lines. Behind the wreckage, barely visible, sat the dark shape of an upright piano, its case warped and peeling, one of the front panel screws long since rusted through and hanging loose. "Clean out special," Pete said, echoing the exact phrase Maya had heard used at every auction like this one. "Somebody want to give me $20 to hold this away." Nobody moved. A reseller near the front actually laughed. "That piano's firewood. Pete, you'd have to pay me to take it." Maya looked at the piano shape behind the ruined bookshelf and felt something she couldn't entirely explain. Not hope exactly, more a stubborn refusal to let an instrument be treated like garbage, even a wrecked one, even one she couldn't be sure would ever make a sound again. $10, she said. Heads turned. Pete raised an eyebrow. I got 10 from the piano teacher. Anybody beat it? No? Going once. Going twice. Sold for $10. A few chuckles rippled through the small crowd. Not unkind exactly. Just a particular condescension reserved for anyone who bid real money on obvious trash. It took Maya and her downstairs neighbor Curtis, a wiry man in his 60s who ran a small appliance repair business and owed her a favor for tutoring his granddaughter, most of an afternoon to extract the piano from the unit and load it into his borrowed pickup truck. The case was heavier than either of them expected, and by the time they wrestled it up the narrow stairs to Maya's apartment, both of them were soaked with sweat, and Curtis was muttering that she'd overpaid by a factor of 10 regardless of what she'd actually bid. She opened the lid that evening, more out of curiosity than any real expectation the thing would be salvageable, and found the interior in worse shape than she'd feared. Several strings snapped, the felt hammers eaten through by moisture and time, the whole mechanism clearly beyond a simple tuning. But it was while she was assessing the damage, running her hand along the underside of the soundboard the way her grandmother had taught her to check for hairline cracks, that her fingers caught on something that didn't belong, a section of the wood paneling beneath the tuning pins that gave slightly under pressure, hinged rather than solid, concealed behind a thin veneer overlay that had been cut and refitted with a precision no factory would have bothered with. It took her nearly 20 minutes with a flathead screwdriver, working carefully so as not to damage whatever was underneath, before the panel came free, revealing a shallow compartment built into the piano's frame that had clearly been added long after the instrument left whatever factory made it. Inside, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag gone brittle and yellow with age, sat a thick stack of documents and a handful of photographs. Maya sat back on her heels, the piano's damaged innards forgotten, and unwrapped the bag with the careful reverence of someone who understood, even before she'd read a single page, that she'd found something that mattered to somebody once, badly enough to hide it inside a piano's frame rather than leave it somewhere easier to find. The documents were financial records, spreadsheets, grant applications, and disbursement records, all bearing the letterhead of a federal recovery program Maya recognized instantly from the years after the storm, the one meant to help homeowners rebuild after the levees failed, the one every family in her neighborhood had either benefited from or, more often, spent years fighting to access while contractors disappeared with their money, and the promised checks never fully arrived. Interspersed among the spreadsheets were photographs, a construction site with a company logo Maya recognized from billboards still standing around the city, a man in a hard hat shaking hands with local officials at what looked like a groundbreaking ceremony, and several photos of houses under renovation that, cross-referenced against the addresses scrawled on the back in careful handwriting, corresponded to streets Maya knew well, streets in her own neighborhood. The name scrawled across the top of the largest spreadsheet, underlined twice, was a name Maya recognized immediately, because his company's name was still on banners around half the rebuilt properties in Gently in the lower ninth, Reginald Toussaint, a developer who'd built his reputation, and a considerable fortune, as one of the recovery-era's celebrated success stories, a local boy who'd stayed and rebuilt when so many outside contractors had come and gone. The spreadsheet told a very different story than the banners did. Column after column detailed grant money received for specific rebuilding projects, cross-reference against actual construction costs that were, in case after case, a small fraction of what had been disbursed. The math wasn't subtle once Maya understood what she was looking at. Toussaint's company had been billing the federal recovery program for full rebuilds on properties that received only partial, cosmetic repairs, pocketing the difference on dozens of homes across years, money that should have gone toward fully repairing houses that, Maya now realized with a sick lurch in her stomach, included at least 2 addresses she recognized as belonging to families of her own students. She spent the rest of that night going through every page, cross-referencing names against people she actually knew, and by early morning she understood 2 things clearly. The first was that whoever had hidden this evidence inside the piano had done so deliberately and carefully, someone with access to Toussaint's internal financial records who'd been building a case against him for a long time. The second was that the piano's previous owner, whoever had rented that storage unit and never come back for it, had very likely been that person, and Maya found herself wondering, with growing unease, what had happened to them, and why the evidence had ended up abandoned in a clean-out unit instead of wherever it was supposed to go. A search of the storage facility's old rental records, which Pete was willing to share after Maya spun a story about trying to track down a family heirloom, turned up the name on Lot 12's original lease, Andre Picard, an accountant, address listed in a part of the lower ninth that Maya knew hadn't been fully rebuilt even now, nearly 2 decades after the storm. A follow-up search turned up an obituary from 4 years earlier, Andre Picard, dead at 58. The note is frustratingly vague about cause of death, survived by a sister in Houston and no other listed family. Maya didn't sleep much over the following 2 nights, turning the discovery over in her mind, torn between the plain civic instinct that this evidence needed to reach someone who could actually do something with it, and a mounting, specific fear that had crystallized the moment she'd read Andre Picard's obituary and done the math on how conveniently timed his death was relative to the documents he'd apparently been sitting on. She thought about simply walking the whole stack into a local news station and being done with it, but something made her cautious enough to make careful photographic copies of every page first, stored on a cloud account under an email address that had nothing to do with her real name, before she did anything else. It was Curtis, of all people, who gave her the push she needed, when she finally told him what she'd found, leaving out most of the specifics, but enough that he understood the shape of it. His reaction wasn't caution. It was a kind of quiet, weary anger she recognized from a dozen conversations she'd had over the years with families in the neighborhood who'd waited years for repairs that never fully materialized. "My sister's house on Law Street," Curtis said. "Toussaint's company did that one. Took 2 years longer than they promised, and it still floods in the back room whenever it rains hard. If what you're saying is true, you owe it to people like her to do something." Maya reached out to a former student's mother who worked as a paralegal, who in turn connected her, cautiously and through several intermediary calls, to a non-profit legal aid organization that had spent years, mostly unsuccessfully, trying to build cases against recovery contractors accused of exactly this kind of fraud. The organization's lead attorney, a sharp, careful woman named Odette Baptiste, met Maya at a coffee shop 2 neighborhoods over from Gently, deliberately chosen, Maya understood without being told, because it wasn't anywhere either of them was likely to be recognized. Baptiste's excitement, once she'd reviewed the photographed documents on her laptop, was tempered by a caution that unsettled Maya more than reassured her. "We've heard rumors about Toussaint's billing practices for years," Baptiste said. "Nobody's ever had documentation this detailed. But I need you to understand what you're holding and who you're dealing with. Toussaint isn't just a contractor anymore. He's on the city's recovery oversight board. He's got relationships with people at every level of local government who benefited from his projects looking successful on paper. If this surfaces the way it needs to, it's not just going to embarrass him. It's going to implicate people who are still in office." 3 days after that meeting, someone broke into Maya's apartment while she was teaching a lesson at a student's house across town. Nothing valuable was taken. Her laptop sat untouched on the kitchen table, her modest jewelry undisturbed in its box, but the piano had been pulled away from the wall, the repaired panel pried open again despite the fact that she'd emptied the compartment days earlier, and every sheet, music, book, and paper in her small apartment had been gone through, drawers left hanging open, the unmistakable signature of someone searching rather than stealing. She called Baptiste in a panic, hands shaking so badly she had to set the phone down twice before she managed to explain what had happened. Baptiste's voice, when she answered, had lost its earlier careful optimism entirely. "Go stay somewhere else tonight," Baptiste said. "Somewhere nobody would think to look for you. Don't tell anyone besides your closest family where you're going. I'll make some calls in the morning." She hadn't even finished packing an overnight bag when a knock came at her door, 3 measured raps that made her whole body go rigid. Through the peephole stood a man she didn't recognize, mid-40s, expensive dark suit that looked out of place against the peeling paint of a hallway, an unreadable pleasant smile already arranged on his face before she'd even opened the door. "Ms. Fontenot," he said once she cracked the door on the chain. "My name is Gerald Vance." I do government relations consulting for several development firms in the city, including Tucson Construction. I understand you may have come across some old paperwork that got mixed up with some property you purchased recently. I'd love to help you sort that out, quietly, in a way that benefits you. I don't know what you're talking about, Maya said, her voice steadier than she felt. Vance's smile didn't waver, but his eyes moved past the shoulder toward the piano visible in the front room, lingering a beat too long. Mr. Toussaint is a generous man, Ms. Fontenot. He'd be glad to make a substantial donation to your music program. Say, $25,000, in exchange for returning whatever old records you might have found. No paperwork, no questions asked on either side. It would solve a great many problems for a woman running a small studio out of her apartment. He paused, letting the implications settle. It would be a shame if problems arose instead. Old buildings like this one have all kinds of code violations that get discovered once someone starts looking closely. Maya shut the door on the chain still fastened, her pulse hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, and did not open it again no matter how patiently Vance knocked twice more before finally, after a long silence, she heard his footsteps recede down the stairs. Maya spent that night at her mother's house on the other side of the neighborhood, sitting up long after her mother had gone to bed, replaying the break-in and Vance's visit in her mind and trying to understand how anyone could have known she had anything worth searching for so quickly. She hadn't told anyone besides Curtis and Baptiste. She'd made her digital copies under an anonymous account. And yet somehow, within days of her meeting with a legal aid attorney, someone had known exactly where to look and exactly what they were looking for. The answer came 2 mornings later, delivered by Baptiste herself in a tense phone call that named the paralegal who'd made the introduction, a young woman named Sesha who, it turned out, had mentioned the meeting in passing to her supervisor at the law firm where she worked her day job, a firm that Baptiste had just discovered through record search of her own, had done substantial contract work for one of Toussaint's shell companies within the last 2 years. Sasha hadn't meant any harm. She'd simply mentioned an interesting case to a colleague she trusted, not realizing the colleague's loyalties ran somewhere she hadn't accounted for. Knowing the leaked source didn't make Maya feel any safer. If anything, it sharpened the fear into something more specific and immediate, the understanding that Toussaint's reach extended into rooms Maya would never have thought to guard against. She spent the following days moving between her mother's house and a friend's spare room 2 parishes over, teaching her lessons by video call rather than in person, jumping at every unfamiliar car that idled too long on the street outside wherever she happened to be staying. It was Odette Baptiste who finally broke the standoff, not through caution but through speed, deciding, after consulting with the Legal Aid Organization's board, that the safest path forward wasn't more careful secrecy but the opposite, getting the documents into enough hands, publicly enough, fast enough, that no single act of intimidation could make the problem disappear. Within a week, Baptiste had shared the photographed evidence with a Federal Recovery Fraud Task Force that had, unbeknownst to either of them, already been quietly investigating Toussaint's company for over a year based on a pattern of complaints from homeowners, but had lacked the kind of granular financial documentation needed to build an actual case. Maya's discovery, it turned out, was a missing piece connecting years of scattered homeowner complaints into a provable pattern of systematic fraud. The task force moved with a speed that surprised even Baptiste. Federal agents executed a search warrant on Toussaint's company offices 11 days after Maya's break-in, seizing financial records that corroborated everything the documents from the piano had shown. Toussaint himself was arrested on federal wire fraud charges 6 weeks later, his construction company's recovery-era contracts placed under review, an outcome that unfolded slowly and imperfectly over the following 2 years, the way these things always do, with Toussaint's lawyers fighting every step, and a trial still pending by the time most of the immediate danger to Maya had faded. What never fully came to light, despite everyone's best efforts, was exactly what had happened to André Picard 4 years earlier. or whether his death had truly been the natural cause the obituary implied. Baptiste's private theory, shared with Meyer only once, quietly over coffee months after the worst of it had passed, was that Picard had likely worked inside Toussaint's company at some point, discovered the fraud, started building his own case, and either died before he could act on it or, more chillingly, had been made to understand that acting on it would cost him more than he was willing to pay. Either way, he'd hidden what he knew carefully enough, and in a place random enough, that it had sat undisturbed inside a piano for years, waiting for someone with nothing to lose and everything to prove to stumble onto it. Maya kept the piano. Eventually, once the immediate danger passed and she'd saved enough to have it properly restored by a technician who specialized in old uprights, the cracked soundboard replaced, the compartment left intact but empty, a strange hollow monument to what it had once carried. She still teaches out of her Gently apartment. More students now than she used to have, several of them children from families whose houses Toussaint's company had shortchanged, families who found their way to her specifically once word spread through the neighborhood about the piano teacher who'd found the proof nobody else could. Curtis's sister on Law Street was among the first homeowners to file a claim once the Federal Task Force's settlement fund opened for affected families, and though the money that finally came through 2 years later never fully made up for the years of flooding and delayed repairs, Curtis told Maya it felt like the first time anyone in his family had been believed rather than placated. Odette Baptiste's legal aid organization saw its funding and caseload both grow substantially in the wake of the Toussaint case, enough that Baptiste was able to hire a second attorney specifically to handle recovery fraud claims, something she told Maya she'd been trying and failing to get approved for years before piano teacher's $10 bid had handed her the case that finally made it possible. She never did get her $10 back, and she likes to tell people, when the story comes up, that it was the best $10 she ever spent, not because of what the piano turned out to be hiding, but because of what it turned out to be worth to her afterward, restored and whole, sitting in the same corner of her apartment where her grandmother's piano used to sit, teaching a new generation of kids from the same streets that had waited so long to be made whole themselves. If Maya's story moved you, hit that like button. Tell me in the comments what you'd have done if you'd found those documents, and subscribe so you never miss the next real-life inheritance mystery, because sometimes the things we almost throw away turn out to be the things that were always going to matter the most.